The grand ballroom glittered, a galaxy of crystal and champagne, but for her, it was a cold, suffocating vacuum. 9 months pregnant, she felt like a fragile planetoid, pulled into the orbit of a dying star, her husband. He stood before her, his eyes glacial, his hand gripping the delicate silk of her maternity gown. The fabric, a soft whisper of hope she'd clung to, was about to be silenced. With one sharp, deliberate tear, he ripped her dress, exposing her, shaming her. A gasp echoed through the stunned silence, but it was drowned out by her own cry as a sudden, warm gush flooded down her legs. Her water had broken. And as the first contraction seized her, she looked past her husband's monstrous face and named the woman who had destroyed their world. The house was beautiful. It wasn't a home, not really, but it was a breathtaking piece of architecture, a testament to her husband's success. It was all clean lines and vast panes of glass that overlooked a city that sparkled like a sea of scattered diamonds at night. She had once loved the view, found it romantic. Now she just saw a million lonely lights, each one a life she couldn't touch, a world she wasn't a part of. She was a curator of this beautiful museum, ensuring the flowers were always fresh, the marble floors were always gleaming, and the silence was never disturbed. Her days followed a quiet, predictable rhythm. Yoga in the morning, in a sun-drenched room, the instructor's voice a soothing balm over the anxious hum in her mind. Then, meetings with the housekeeper about menus, or the event planner for whichever charity gala was next on the calendar. Lunches with women whose names she sometimes forgot. Their conversations a dizzying carousel of decorators, designers, and divorces. They all lived in gilded cages, their laughter as brittle as the champagne flutes they held. She would smile, nod, and say all the right things. But a part of her was always somewhere else, floating high above the polite chatter, looking down and wondering how she had ended up here. He had found her in a small art gallery, where her own paintings, vibrant and full of raw emotion, had been on display. He had been captivated, he'd said, by her passion, by the way she saw the world. He was older, established, a titan of industry with a magnetic confidence that had swept her off her feet. He had promised her the world, and he had delivered it, piece by gleaming, expensive piece. He'd built a state-of-the-art studio for her in their glass house, a sanctuary where she was supposed to create. But the blank canvases gathered dust. The passion he'd so admired seemed to have dried up, leaving behind a dull ache of emptiness. How could she paint a world of color when she was living in shades of gray? Their love story had been a whirlwind. He was a force of nature, decisive and powerful, and she had been drawn to his strength, a moth to a flame. He made her feel safe, cherished, protected from the harsh realities of the world. In the beginning, his possessiveness had felt like devotion. The way he'd call her a dozen times a day, the way he'd want to know where she was, who she was with. It had all seemed like a symptom of a deep, all-consuming love. He had isolated her so slowly, so masterfully, that she hadn't even noticed it happening. Her old friends had drifted away, intimidated by his wealth and his subtle disapproval. Her family, living in a different state, felt more and more distant with each passing year. He had become her entire world. The pregnancy had been a surprise, a tiny crack of light in the sterile perfection of their lives. For a while, it had changed things. He had been ecstatic, attentive, the man she had first fallen in love with. He would place his hand on her growing belly, a look of awe on his face, and talk about the future, about their son. They had picked out a name, designed a nursery, and for a fleeting, beautiful moment, the glass house had started to feel like a home. She had allowed herself to hope, to believe that this baby would be the glue that would mend the invisible fractures in their marriage. But as the months wore on, the distance had returned, creeping back in like a silent fog. He started working late again, his excuses vague, his phone always angled away from her. The scent of an unfamiliar perfume would cling to his clothes, a scent he'd brush off as belonging to a client or a colleague. The late-night calls, the hushed conversations. He had an explanation for everything, and he delivered them with such cool conviction that she had almost believed him. To question him felt like a betrayal, a crack in the perfect facade she was expected to maintain. Doubt was a weed, and she was terrified of letting it grow. She would lie awake at night, her body heavy with the child they had created, and listen to the sound of his steady breathing beside her. He was a stranger, a handsome, powerful stranger who shared her bed. The intimacy between them had become a performance, a duty she fulfilled with a hollow heart. She would close her eyes and pretend, summoning memories of the man who had loved her paintings, the man who had promised her a life of passion and adventure. But the memories were faded photographs, and the man beside her was a cold, hard reality. She was so lonely. It was a deep, profound loneliness that settled in her bones, a constant companion in the echoing halls of their magnificent house. She would talk to the baby, her hand resting on her belly, her voice a soft whisper in the quiet rooms. She told him about her dreams, about the life she had once imagined for herself. A life filled with art and laughter and messy, chaotic love. She promised him that his life would be different, that he would be loved fiercely, unconditionally. He was her secret, her hope, the one pure thing in a life that had become a beautiful lie. This gala, the annual centerpiece of the city's social calendar, felt like a precipice. It was the last major event before the baby was due, and she felt a sense of foreboding she couldn't shake. Something was going to happen. The threads of their carefully constructed world were stretching thin, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that they were about to snap. The dress arrived in a ridiculously large box, swathed in layers of tissue paper that whispered like secrets. It was a custom creation, a sweep of midnight blue silk designed to both celebrate and accommodate the final heavy stage of her pregnancy. Her husband had commissioned it from a Parisian designer, a grand gesture meant to showcase her, his beautiful, expectant wife, at the apex of the social season. He had presented it to her with a flourish, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Only the best for you," he'd said, his voice smooth as the silk itself. She ran her hand over the fabric. It was cool and impossibly soft, cascading from the empire waist in a way that was meant to be ethereal. It was a masterpiece of design, a perfect blend of elegance and comfort. It was also a lie. The dress was not for her. It was for the world, for the photographers who would line the red carpet, for the society columnists who would write about them in glowing terms. It was a costume for the role she was playing, the adored wife of a powerful man. As she stood before the full-length mirror, the dress pooling at her feet, she felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. The woman staring back at her was a stranger. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with a weariness that no amount of makeup could conceal. The dress, for all its beauty, felt like a weight, another layer in the elaborate construction of her life. She thought of the simple cotton dresses she used to wear, splattered with paint, comfortable and real. This silk felt like a shroud. The day of the gala was a flurry of orchestrated activity. The makeup artist arrived, a cheerful woman who chattered about celebrity gossip as she expertly erased the dark circles from under her eyes. The hairstylist, a stern man with an artist's temperament, sculpted her hair into an elegant chignon, each pin a tiny, sharp prick against her scalp. They moved around her with practiced efficiency, transforming her, polishing her, preparing her for display. She sat silently through it all, a doll being dressed for a party. Her husband was in his own wing of the house, going through his own ritual. She could hear the faint murmur of his voice on the phone, a low, clipped tone he used for business. Or was it business? The question hung in the air, a poisonous, unasked thing. A few weeks ago, a credit card statement had arrived, one she wasn't meant to see. Tucked among the charges for exorbitant business lunches and private jets was a recurring payment to a high-end floral boutique she had never heard of, and a charge for a delicate diamond necklace from a jeweler they never frequented. When she'd tentatively brought it up, he had dismissed it instantly. A gift for his mother's birthday, he'd said, his gaze unwavering. A lie. She knew it was a lie. His mother's birthday had been 2 months prior. The knowledge had settled in her stomach like a cold, hard stone. She had started to look, to pay attention to the small things. The way his hand would hover over his phone, ready to snatch it away if she came too close. The scent of that other woman's perfume, sometimes faint, sometimes strong enough to make her choke. And then there was the name, whispered during a phone call he thought she couldn't hear. Just a name, but it had seared itself into her brain. She had looked her up, of course. It was sickeningly easy. A young, ambitious woman who worked at one of his subsidiary companies. Her social media profile was a curated collection of smiling photos, exotic trips, and subtle hints of a lavish lifestyle her salary couldn't possibly afford. In one photo, a delicate diamond necklace glittered at her throat. The same one from the jeweler's statement. The pain of it was a physical thing, a constant, dull ache behind her ribs. It was the betrayal, yes, but it was also the humiliation. He was so careless, so arrogant. Did he think she was a fool? Or did he simply not care if she knew? She hadn't confronted him. What would be the point? He would lie, his voice smooth and reasonable, and he would make her feel like she was the one who was crazy, paranoid, ungrateful. He was a master of turning the tables, of making her doubt her own reality. So she had remained silent, the knowledge festering inside her, poisoning everything. When he finally walked into her dressing room, he was immaculate in his custom tuxedo. He looked like the man on the cover of a magazine, powerful and handsome. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over her. "Perfect," he said, the single word a verdict. He walked over and placed a cold, hard box in her hand. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, were diamond earrings, each one a star of brilliant, cold fire. They were meant to match the dress, to complete the picture. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Her fingers felt numb as she fumbled to put them on. He watched her, his expression unreadable. "Are you ready?" he asked. She looked at her reflection one last time. The woman in the mirror looked beautiful, poised, serene. Her hair was perfect, her makeup flawless, her diamonds glittering. The midnight blue silk of her dress flowed around her, a river of elegance. But her eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of a woman on the edge of a cliff, the wind whipping around her, the ground crumbling beneath her feet. "Yes," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm ready." As they walked down the grand staircase, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, she felt a sudden fierce kick from the baby. It was a jolt, a reminder of the life inside her, the one thing that was truly hers. In that moment, a strange calm settled over her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was joined by something else, a tiny, hard spark of anger. It was the first time in a long time she had felt anything other than sadness and confusion. It was a flicker of the woman she used to be, the woman who painted with bold strokes and wasn't afraid of the truth. The gala wasn't a precipice after all, she realized. It was a stage. And the final act was about to begin. The ballroom was a symphony of excess. 1,000 tiny lights twinkled in the massive crystal chandeliers, casting a warm, golden glow over the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. The air hummed with the sound of polite laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft strains of a string quartet. It was a scene of opulent perfection, a world away from the ugly reality of her life. As they made their entrance, a ripple of attention followed them. Heads turned, whispers followed in their wake. They were the golden couple, the envy of everyone in the room. He played his part perfectly, his arm wrapped securely around her, his smile radiating charm and success. He was the king in his court, and she was his prized possession. She moved through the room on his arm, a graceful automaton. She smiled at faces she vaguely recognized, accepted compliments on her dress with a quiet thank you, and allowed him to steer her from one conversation to another. He introduced her to business associates, political figures, people whose names were headlines. He would speak of her with a cloying, proprietary pride. "My beautiful, talented wife," he would say, the artist behind the man. The irony was so thick she could have choked on it. She hadn't picked up a paintbrush in years. She felt the baby shift inside her, a heavy, restless weight. The heat of the room, the crush of people, the cloying scent of 100 different perfumes, it was all starting to feel overwhelming. A dull ache began to spread across her lower back, a persistent throb she tried to ignore. She needed to sit down, to catch her breath, but he was in his element, navigating the powerful currents of the room with an expert's ease. An hour into the evening, she saw her. The woman from the photographs. She was standing across the room, talking to a small group of people, a glass of champagne in her hand. She was younger than her, of course, with a hungry, ambitious look in her eyes. She was wearing a blood-red dress that clung to her like a second skin, a stark, deliberate contrast to her own midnight blue. And there, at her throat, was the necklace. It glittered under the chandelier light, a tiny, triumphant star. Their eyes met across the crowded room. It was only for a second, but it was enough. The other woman's lips curved into a small, knowing smile, a look of such blatant, insolent confidence that it stole her breath. There was no shame in her eyes, no guilt, only victory. In that moment, all the pieces clicked into place. The late nights, the secret calls, the lies. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a certainty, cold and sharp as a shard of glass in her heart. Her husband, oblivious, was deep in conversation with a senator. She felt a sudden, desperate need for air. I'm going to the powder room," she murmured, pulling her arm from his. He barely glanced at her, nodding dismissively before turning back to his conversation. The casualness of it, the utter lack of concern, was another small cut. She made her way through the throng, her movements slow and heavy. The backache was getting worse, a tightening band of pressure. She felt dizzy, disoriented. As she neared the grand, arched doorway that led to the restrooms, a hand caught her arm. She turned, her heart lurching to find herself face to face with the other woman. "You must be the wife," the woman said, her voice low and laced with a condescending sweetness. She didn't even try to hide the necklace, her hand straying to it as she spoke. She couldn't find her voice. She could only stare, her mind a chaotic whirl of pain and rage. "He's told me so much about you," the woman continued, her smile widening. "The artist. It's a charming little hobby for you, isn't it? something to keep you busy while he's out conquering the world." Every word was a carefully aimed dart. She was mocking her, belittling her, enjoying her pain. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. "What do you want?" she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. The woman laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Want? Oh, I already have what I want. I just thought it was time we were properly introduced. After all, we have so much in common." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He's an amazing man, isn't he? So powerful, so generous." The implication was clear, the insult deliberate. She was flaunting her victory, rubbing her nose in the dirt of her husband's betrayal. A white-hot fury, fierce and protective, surged through her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, a roaring fire that burned away the fog of sadness and submission. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the child she was carrying, the child whose father was standing across the room, laughing, while his mistress taunted his pregnant wife. "You know nothing about him," she said, her voice low and shaking with a cold rage she didn't know she possessed. "And you know nothing about me." The woman's smile faltered for a second, surprised by her sudden backbone. But she recovered quickly. "Oh, I think I know everything I need to know. He's tired of playing house with a sad little doll. He wants a real woman, someone who can keep up with him." Just then, her husband appeared at her side, his hand landing on her back. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his eyes flicking between the two of them. His smile was still in place, but she could see a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He didn't want a scene. "We were just introducing ourselves," the other woman said, her voice instantly changing, becoming deferential, sweet. "I was just telling your lovely wife how much I admire her." She shot her a look, a silent dare. He looked at her, his eyes cold, demanding her compliance. He expected her to play along, to smile and pretend, to uphold the facade. But something inside her had broken. The carefully constructed dam of her silence had cracked. "She was just telling me," she said, her voice clear and steady, her eyes locked on her husband's, "that you're tired of me." The air crackled. The polite hum of the gala seemed to fade into a distant buzz, the opulent ballroom shrinking until it contained only the three of them, trapped in a triangle of deceit and betrayal. Her husband's face, which had been a mask of genial charm moments before, hardened into something she recognized all too well: cold, controlled fury. His fingers tightened on her back, a silent, painful command to stop. The mistress took a small step back, her eyes wide with feigned innocence, a picture of a wronged party caught in a misunderstanding. She was a performer, and this was her most challenging role yet. "Darling, what on earth are you talking about?" he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, meant for her ears only. He attempted a laugh, a hollow, unconvincing sound for the benefit of any onlookers. "My wife is just feeling a little overwhelmed. The heat, the crowd, it's a lot, especially in her condition." He was trying to paint her as hysterical, irrational, the classic, cruel dismissal, the pregnant, hormonal wife, losing her grip on reality. The old her would have crumbled, would have let the shame and confusion silence her. But the fire that had ignited inside her was now a raging inferno. "Don't," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Don't you dare manage me! Don't you dare stand here and lie to my face!" She looked from his tightening jaw to the woman in red, whose triumphant smirk was now tinged with a flicker of panic. This was not going according to her script. "I know who she is," she said, her gaze returning to her husband. "I know everything." The color drained from his face. The pretense of control vanished, replaced by raw, naked anger. His eyes, which she had once found so captivating, were now chips of ice. He saw his perfect world, the one he had built on a foundation of lies, beginning to fracture. and he saw her as the cause. "You're making a scene," he hissed, his grip on her arm now bruisingly tight as he tried to pull her away from the center of attention, towards the exit, towards the shadows where he could control her. "No," she said, pulling back, her feet rooted to the spot. "I'm done with scenes. I'm done with your stage." A sharp, intense pain shot through her lower back, making her gasp. It was different from the dull ache before, stronger, more urgent. A contraction. The baby was responding to her distress, a silent participant in the unfolding drama. "We are leaving." "Now," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. He started to physically propel her towards the door, his strength overwhelming. People were starting to stare, their polite smiles freezing, their eyes filled with morbid curiosity. The golden couple was tarnishing before their very eyes. "Let go of me!" she cried, struggling against his grip. The public nature of his aggression, the humiliation of being manhandled in front of all these people, fueled her defiance. And then it happened. In a moment of pure, unrestrained fury, his control snapped. His face contorted into a mask of rage. He wasn't seeing his pregnant wife. He was seeing an obstacle, a threat to his reputation. He grabbed the front of her dress, the beautiful midnight blue silk he had gifted her. With his other hand, he held her arm, and he pulled. The sound of ripping fabric was shockingly loud in the sudden, absolute silence of the ballroom. It was a sharp, violent tear that seemed to echo in the vast, gilded space. The dress, a symbol of their perfect, fabricated life, was torn open from the neckline down, exposing the simple maternity chemise she wore beneath. A collective gasp swept through the room. It was an act of such profound public cruelty that no one could look away. He had not just ripped her dress, he had stripped her of her dignity, branded her as disposable in front of their entire world. She stood there, stunned, the cool air of the ballroom on her exposed skin. The torn silk hung from her body in ruined strips, but the physical shock was nothing compared to the emotional devastation. It was the ultimate act of contempt, a final, brutal declaration that she and the life she carried meant nothing to him. And then, a second shock, this one entirely physical. A sudden, undeniable gush of warmth flooded down her legs, soaking the tatters of her dress, puddling on the polished marble floor. The contraction that followed was immense, a vice of pain that gripped her entire body, forcing a raw, guttural cry from her lips. Her water had broken. The world tilted, the glittering lights of the chandeliers blurring into streaks. The faces of the onlookers swam before her eyes, a gallery of shock and pity. Her husband stared at the spreading pool at her feet, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. He had gone too far. He had broken everything. Through the haze of pain, she saw the mistress, her face ashen, her triumphant little fantasy having curdled into a public nightmare. She was already trying to melt back into the crowd, to disappear, to sever herself from the ugly scene. But she wouldn't let her. Summoning a final ounce of strength, she raised a trembling hand, her finger pointing directly at the woman in the blood-red dress. Her voice, when it came out, was not a whisper, but a clear, ringing cry that cut through the stunned silence of the grand ballroom. "Her!" she screamed, the sound raw with agony and betrayal. "The name of his mistress is Veronica!" The chaos that erupted was instantaneous. The pristine, ordered world of the Gala shattered into a million panicked pieces. People surged forward, a wave of horrified curiosity. The sharp, insistent clicks of camera phones began, vultures descending on the kill. Her husband, jolted from his stunned horror, finally reacted. He lunged not towards her but towards the photographers, his face a mask of primal fury. "No pictures!" he roared, his voice cracking with desperation as he tried to shield his crumbling empire from the flashbulbs. But she barely saw him. The world had compressed to the blinding pain that was tearing through her. Two waiters and a woman in a shimmering gold dress, her face a blur of kindness, were suddenly at her side, helping her to a chair that had appeared from nowhere. Someone was on the phone, their voice urgent, shouting for an ambulance. The name Veronica hung in the air, an accusation that had taken on a life of its own, ricocheting through the whispers of the crowd. The journey to the hospital was a surreal nightmare. The wail of the siren was a soundtrack to the throbbing rhythmic agony of her contractions. The kind woman in the gold dress, whose name she never learned, held her hand, her thumb rubbing gentle circles on her skin, murmuring soothing, meaningless words. Her husband was in the front of the ambulance, his back ramrod straight, his voice a low, furious murmur on the phone. He wasn't talking to a doctor. He was talking to his lawyer, to his publicist. He was doing damage control while she was bringing his child into the world. The realization was so cold, so clear, that it cut through the pain for a moment, leaving her with a chilling, hollow clarity. The hospital was a blur of bright lights, sterile smells, and urgent, clipped voices. She was transferred to a gurney, wheeled through corridors, the torn remnants of her beautiful silk dress a grim, trailing banner of her humiliation. Nurses and doctors swarmed around her, their faces professional and detached. They asked questions she couldn't answer, their voices muffled by the roaring in her ears. How far apart were the contractions? Had her water broken? She could only nod or shake her head, trapped in the relentless cycle of pain and release. They put her in a room, a stark, functional space that was the antithesis of the gilded ballroom. They cut away the rest of her dress and put her in a rough hospital gown. An IV was inserted into her hand. A monitor was strapped around her swollen belly, and the rhythmic, powerful whoosh of her baby's heartbeat filled the room. It was the only sound that mattered, a steady, strong anchor in the storm of her body's turmoil. Her husband appeared in the doorway hours later. The contractions were closer now, the pain a living thing. He had changed out of his tuxedo into a nondescript polo shirt and slacks. He looked smaller, diminished, the swaggering confidence of the Gala stripped away, leaving behind a man who looked pale and frayed. He stood there awkwardly, his hands shoved in his pockets, his eyes avoiding hers. "How are you?" he asked, the question so inadequate, so absurd, that she almost laughed. She didn't answer. She just turned her head on the pillow and focused on the monitor, on the steady, reassuring beat of her son's heart. He took a hesitant step into the room. "Look," he began, his voice low, "about what happened at the gala." "Don't!" she interrupted, her voice raspy. "Don't say anything, not now." She didn't have the strength for his excuses, for his carefully crafted apologies that would inevitably twist the blame back onto her. She needed every ounce of her energy for what was coming. Another contraction seized her, and she gasped, her body arching off the bed. A nurse bustled in, her expression all business. "Okay, we're getting close now," she said, her voice calm and competent. The hours that followed were a primal blur of pain, sweat, and exhaustion. The world narrowed to the confines of that room, to the instructions of the doctor and the nurses, to the relentless, powerful waves that were bringing her son into the world. Her husband was a ghost in the corner of the room, a silent, useless observer. At one point he tried to take her hand, but she pulled it away, her rejection swift and absolute. He was a stranger to her, a man she had once loved, but whose face she could barely stand to look at. The intimacy of this moment, the raw, beautiful, terrifying process of birth, was something he had forfeited the right to be a part of. He had chosen his side in the ballroom, and it wasn't hers. And then, after an eternity of effort, it was over. A final, monumental push, and then a sudden, shocking release. A cry, thin and startlingly loud, pierced the air. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, his voice warm with triumph. They laid him on her chest, a tiny, squirming, red-faced creature, impossibly small and yet so solid. He was perfect. He was real. She looked at his screwed-up little face, his dark tuft of hair, and a love so fierce, so overwhelming, washed over her, cleansing the pain, the betrayal, the humiliation. Nothing else mattered. The glittering galas, the glass house, the man in the corner, it was all dust. This tiny, breathing soul in her arms was her world now. She looked up, and her eyes met her husband's. He was staring at the baby, his expression a complicated mess of awe, guilt, and something she couldn't quite decipher. For a fleeting second, she saw a flicker of the man he used to be, the man who had been so excited about becoming a father. He took a step towards the bed, his hand outstretched, as if to touch his son. "What's his name?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. She looked down at the beautiful, perfect baby in her arms. She thought of the name they had picked out together months ago, in a happier time. It was a strong, classic name, a name he had chosen. But that name belonged to a life that no longer existed, to a dream that had died on a marble floor. This child, born of such pain and turmoil, deserved a new beginning. She looked back at her husband, her gaze clear and steady. "His name," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable, "is my father's name, not yours." The first few days in the hospital were a strange, suspended reality. The world outside, with its brewing scandal and shattered reputations, was a distant storm she could hear rumbling on the horizon. But here, in the quiet, sterile bubble of the maternity ward, her universe had shrunk to the size of the tiny human cradled in her arms. Her son. The weight of him, so small and yet so profound, was a constant, grounding presence. Her body ached. She was exhausted in a way she had never known, a deep, cellular weariness. But her mind, for the first time in years, felt startlingly clear. The fog of confusion, of self-doubt, of trying to contort herself into the woman she thought her husband wanted, had been burned away in the crucible of the Gala. Lying in the hospital bed, with the steady rhythm of her baby's breathing against her chest, she felt a quiet, unfamiliar strength begin to knit itself together inside her. He came to the hospital every day. He brought extravagant bouquets of flowers that filled the small room with a cloying, funereal scent. He brought gifts, a ridiculously expensive cashmere baby blanket, a tiny designer onesie. He would stand by the bassinet, staring at their son with a look of bewildered wonder. He was trying, in his clumsy, transactional way, to fix what he had broken. He thought he could buy his way back into her life, that a grand enough gesture could erase the image of his hand tearing her dress, of his indifference as she crumpled in pain. Their conversations were stilted, brittle things. He would talk about the incident, as he called it, his voice low and laced with a manufactured remorse. He blamed the stress of work, the pressure, the alcohol. He never blamed himself. He spoke of Veronica as a mistake, a meaningless diversion. He had already fired her, he told her, as if that would somehow cauterize the wound. He had cut her out of his life, a loose end snipped and discarded. He expected her to be grateful. "We can get through this," he said during one of his visits, his voice earnest. He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. She let it lie there, limp and unresponsive in his grasp. "We have a son. We can be a family. We'll go away, take a long vacation, just the three of us. We can put this all behind us." She looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the panic. It wasn't love she saw there, or even true remorse. It was fear. He was afraid of losing control, of his perfect world collapsing. He was afraid of the public fallout, the divorce, the financial implications. He was not afraid of losing her. He had lost her long ago. He just hadn't realized it until now. "I need you to leave," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the anger or hysteria he was expecting. He looked taken aback. "What, I just got here?" "No," she said, gently removing her hand from his. "I mean, I need you to go home, pack a bag, and leave the house." The color drained from his face. "Don't be ridiculous. That's our home." "It's my home now," she said, the words tasting strange and powerful on her tongue. "It's my son's home. There is no our anymore. You destroyed that on the ballroom floor." His fear curdled back into anger. "You can't be serious. After everything I've given you? You're going to throw it all away over one mistake? One mistake?" She let out a short, bitter laugh. "This wasn't one mistake. This was 1,000 small betrayals, 1,000 lies. Tearing my dress wasn't the mistake. It was just the first time you were honest." He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He was seeing her for the first time, not as an accessory or a possession, but as a person with a will of her own. And he didn't know what to do. He left without another word, the door closing with a soft click behind him. The scent of his expensive cologne lingered in the air. An unwelcome ghost. The hospital became her sanctuary, a place to heal, both physically and emotionally. Her parents flew in, their faces etched with worry. Her mother sat by her bed for hours, holding her hand, not asking too many questions, just being there. Her father, a quiet, gentle man, would simply hold his grandson, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Their unconditional love was a balm on her raw, wounded heart. They didn't judge her. They didn't tell her what to do. They just loved her and reminded her of a time when she had been loved for who she was, not for the role she played. Her old friends started calling, tentative at first, then with an outpouring of support. They had seen the news, the blurry photos, the speculative headlines. They had been kept at a distance by her husband for years, but now they broke through the walls he had built, their voices a welcome chorus of solidarity. She realized how much she had missed them, how lonely she had been. He had isolated her so completely that she had forgotten what true friendship felt like. On her last day in the hospital, her lawyer came to see her. He was a sharp, no-nonsense man her father had hired. He laid out her options, speaking in calm, measured tones about divorce proceedings, custody arrangements, financial settlements. The words were clinical, but the implications were life-altering. It was real. This was happening. As she signed the initial paperwork, her hand was steady. She was no longer the trembling, uncertain woman who had walked into that gala. She was a mother. Her priority was no longer to maintain a beautiful facade, but to build a safe, honest, and loving world for her son. A world where he would never have to witness the kind of casual cruelty she had endured. When she was discharged, she didn't go back to the glass house on the hill. Not yet. She went with her parents to the hotel where they were staying. That night, she lay in the simple, anonymous hotel bed, her son sleeping peacefully in a bassinet beside her. The city lights twinkled outside the window, the same lights she had once looked at with such a sense of detachment. But now, they looked different. They didn't look like 1,000,000 lonely souls anymore. They looked like 1,000,000 possibilities. For the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost forever. Hope. She was terrified, yes, but she was also free. A month after her son was born, she returned to the house. It was a strange homecoming. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt like peace. The vast, empty rooms that had once echoed with her loneliness now felt like a blank canvas, waiting for a new life to be painted upon it. Her husband was gone, his belongings cleared out by an assistant in a swift, impersonal transaction. All that remained of him was a faint indentation on his side of the bed and the lingering scent of his cologne in the closet. A scent she quickly banished with open windows and fresh air. Her parents stayed for another week, helping her settle in, their presence a warm, comforting blanket. They cooed over their grandson, filled the cavernous kitchen with the smells of home cooking, and treated her not as a fragile, broken thing, but as the strong, capable woman they had raised. When they finally left, the silence that descended was not lonely, but contemplative. It was hers. Life found a new rhythm, one dictated by feeding schedules and diaper changes, of sleepless nights and gummy early morning smiles. It was exhausting, relentless work, but it was real. It was meaningful. Her son was her anchor, her purpose. Every decision she made for him. The divorce was proceeding, a messy, ugly battle waged through lawyers. Her husband fought her on every point, his pride wounded, his anger a palpable force even from a distance. The media frenzy had died down, replaced by other scandals, but their story had become a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. She ignored it all. Her world was the four walls of her home, the curve of her son's cheek, the warmth of his body against hers. One afternoon, while the baby was napping, she found herself drawn to the one room she had avoided since her return, the art studio. It was just as she had left it, pristine and unused, the canvases white and accusing. The air was thick with the dust of forgotten dreams. She ran her hand over a taut, blank canvas, the rough texture a familiar ghost under her fingertips. She thought of the woman her husband had accused her of being, the sad little doll with a charming hobby. The words had been meant to wound, to diminish her. And they had. But now they felt like a challenge. For years, she had allowed his view of her to become her own. She had believed his subtle narrative that her art was trivial, a distraction from her real job, which was to be his wife. She had let the well of her creativity run dry, believing she had nothing left to say. But she had a story to tell now, a story of pain, of betrayal, of resilience, a story of a love so fierce it could withstand anything. She picked up a piece of charcoal, its dusty blackness a comfort in her hand. Without thinking, without planning, she began to sketch. The first lines were hesitant, shaky, but soon they found their rhythm. She wasn't drawing an object or a landscape. She was drawing a feeling, the jagged, tearing line of ripped silk, the explosive, radiating lines of a silent scream, the soft, protective curve of a mother's arms around a child. She worked for hours, losing all track of time, the charcoal a dark stain on her fingers, her clothes, her face. When she finally stepped back, the canvas was no longer blank. It was raw, chaotic, and fiercely alive. It was ugly and beautiful all at once. It was the truth. And it was the most honest thing she had created in years. A few weeks later, Veronica called her. The name on the caller ID made her stomach clench, but she answered, her voice calm. The other woman's voice was thin, stripped of its former confidence. She had lost her job, she said. Her reputation was in tatters. The life she had been promised had evaporated overnight. She had called, she said, to apologize. It was a weak, self-pitying apology, the kind offered by someone who was sorry they got caught, not for what they had done. "I don't forgive you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Forgiveness is something you'll have to find for yourself. But I'm not going to carry my anger for you anymore. It's too heavy, and I need my hands free for my son." She hung up the phone, a small, clean click that severed the final thread. The day the divorce was finalized, she felt not triumph, but a quiet, solemn release. It was the closing of a chapter, a long, painful chapter of her life. That evening, she took her son out onto the terrace. The city glittered below them, the same sea of diamonds. But she saw it differently now. She saw the intricate web of connections, of stories, of beginnings and endings. Her husband had tried to rip her world apart, to expose and shame her, and for a moment, he had succeeded. But he had underestimated her. He hadn't realized that by tearing away the beautiful, suffocating silk, he had allowed her to breathe. He had set her free. The life he had given her was a gilded cage. The life she was building now, on her own terms, was an unwritten masterpiece. And she was finally ready to paint it. She held her son close, his small head nestled in the crook of her neck, and looked out at the vast, sparkling expanse. She was no longer a sad little doll in a glass house. She was an artist. She was a survivor. She was a mother. And for the first time, looking at the city lights, she didn't feel lonely at all. She felt like she was home. This story navigates a web of betrayal, cruelty, and the discovery of inner strength. What would you have done in her place? Would you have sought revenge, tried to forgive, or walked away to build a new life, just as she did? Share your thoughts in the comments below.